There you go,
Okay,
Terence.
on behalf of the Northern Irish Gardens Heritage Trust, it is my pleasure tonight to welcome Christy Boylan to give our spring lecture this year. As most of you will know, most of you will know Christy, and he has written a book recently on Parks and Gardens of Dublin, which is due out shortly. And it's around this subject we asked Christy to talk, all looking forward as we are to the appearance of this book. So Christy is a well-known figure to everybody in the world of Irish horticulture and landscape architecture. Since 2009, he's been a lecturer at the Dublin Technological University based in Blanchardstown. And before that, he has been a senior executive landscape architect with Dublin Corporation, and then head of the Parks and Landscape Services Department. He's published lots of papers over the years. He's spoken at numerous national and international conferences, and he has been involved in many organizations. And I'll give you some examples. He's a founder member and first a president of the Irish Tree Council. That's, I think, going way back to the mid-1980s. He's a fellow and former president of the Irish Landscape Institute. He's a former chair of the World Park Academy, and he indeed is a recipient of their inaugural Distinguished Award, Individual Award. He's a former secretary of the World Urban Parks. He's also long been involved with the IFPRA, which is the International Federation of Parks and Recreation Administration, which, of those, if you don't know, is an organization representing and providing a forum for people involved in the provision and management of parks. And he's been its vice president and secretary for Europe. He's also been very much involved with Entente Floréale Europe, which, for those of you, again, who don't know, is backed by an association devoted principally to sustainable development of towns and villages and promoting a greener and more pleasant environment in 6 European countries. It was initially just England and France. Towards these aims, the association hosts annual competitions, and Christy has been for some years one of the national and international adjudicators. Indeed, he is presently chairman of the international jury. And back home, he's also involved as an adjudicator in the National Tidy Towns competition. With all these activities and others, which I have not listed, it's a wonder that Christy ever found time to write what we know is a substantial and authoritative book in Dublin's Parks and Gardens. But he's been involved with these parks, large and small, for most of his life. So there is no better person to talk on the subject, and it's therefore with much pleasure that I hand over to Christy, everybody. Christy.
Thank you very much, Terence. I'll share the screen now, first of all.
If we could ask everyone else to mute before we start the lecture.
Okay, can you all see the screen at this stage?
Yes.
I can't get any sound. Yeah,
Then before you start, there's just a bit of noise in the background. If people could,
yes,
your speaker.
I wrote this. I don't know.
I'm going to mute all, Christy, and I'm just going to get you to start again.
Do that, yeah.
No. So, Christy, if you could unmute there. So, Christy, just unmute. Christy, you're on mute.
No, I had to go out to do unmute, so I have to go back in now to share. Okay, can you all hear me now? Can you all hear me? Okay, thank you. Of course, they can't respond, isn't that right? Thank you very much, Terence, for that introduction, and to the Northern Ireland Heritage Garden Trust for inviting me to make this presentation, which I'm delighted to do, because this book, which is due out hopefully for Bloom, has been something I've been wanting to do for decades. And it was COVID that was the big impetus for this, because a lot of the activities that were mentioned by Terence were not possible because of COVID. So I said, right, now is the time. So I had a lot of information gathered up over the years, but I also found this was a wonderful time to embark on this, because the internet is a wonderful resource for all sorts of reports and even newspaper articles and so on. So this is the cover of the book, and it's a picture, as most people seem to have recognized, is the Phoenix Park, identified by the lighting standard. Now, it should move forward. It is, yeah. Now, why write a book on the parks of Dublin? Well, there are 17,537 acres of parks in the Dublin area. And if you look at this pie chart, you'll see that there were 1,900 acres up to 1,800. Now, a big chunk of that was the Phoenix Park, because Phoenix Park goes back to when it became a royal park in 1662. And then from 1800 to 1900, another 1,600 acres were added. And then from 1900 to 1960, now I didn't say 20th century here, I said 1900 to 1960. And that's chosen because it was 1960 when the movement to build parks in Dublin really started. But from then on, from 1960 to 2000, you can see there's a volume of 13,000 parks, acres of parks have been provided. And even since the millennium, there's another 1,300 acres, and it's still growing. Now, how does that link to the population? Well, from 2022, the census tells us that Dublin City and County has 1.5 million people, but we're now accustomed to talking about Greater Dublin, and that's 2.1 million, 40% of the country. And that includes Meath, Kildare, and Wicklow. But where are all these parks? Well, you can see the green spot in the middle, that's Dublin City Council, and it's got 1,400 hectares. Now, this is what's managed by Dublin City Council. If you look at the top box, you see that the Office of Public Works has stick with acres, 2,325 acres. That includes the Phoenix Park and St. Stephen's Green and St. Enda's Park in Redfarnham and some other little places. In 1994, Dublin Council was broken into three and taken in Dún Laoghaire, and there are now Fingal County Council, South Dublin County Council, and Dún Laoghaire right down. Now, the one with all the land there is Fingal County Council. They have 5,560 acres. You'll see I'm using hectares as well, but for simplicity, the book refers to acres all the time because we're more familiar with those. So 17,325 acres. So that's a reason to celebrate that we have all those parks. But the celebration on my part is the book, which will be out before Bloom, I'm hopeful, and it will have 15 chapters. Believe it or not, since I tried to do this years ago, I did talk to publishers. I had different chapter titles, but as time went by, the chapter titles made themselves. The book is supported by the 4 Dublin authorities and the Office of Public Works, but we do not want it to be broken down onto geographical areas. So that's why the title of the chapters are a little bit chronological, but mostly it's on thematic. The themes such as former domains of plant collections. And I find that this adds a value to the particular parks, because I find that many people won't know some of these parks. And as Tern said, I've been involved with many of them. I was 18 years in Dublin City and 14 years in South Dublin. But rather than A to Z, they're broken up into chapters. For example, we've one on plant collections, which would include the Botanic Gardens, and does include, and river valleys and canal parks, and then commemorative parks and heritage parks and gardens. So what I propose to do in the following slides is to bring you through some of these chapters with only maybe a picture or two, because you obviously couldn't get through all of them. There's 600 pages approximately in this book, and about 1,000 images, most of which are mine. Some are important images of maps and so on, done by others, and illustrations. But the publishers are Wordwell. And starting with history, these are the men, and it's men, I'm sorry, ladies, that were doing this, as all these jobs were open to men in the beginning, who were responsible for managing the parks in Dublin, starting on the left with Barney O'Reilly, who died in 2011. He was park superintendent for Dublin Corporation from 1951 to 1979. He came from the Botanic Gardens, where he was outdoor foreman, and he had a great reputation of solving all sorts of problems in unorthodox ways, let's say. He was assisted by Jim Shannon, who died in 1994, and he became the park superintendent who replaced him, and he retired about 1990. Now, down at the bottom right is Dennis Shannon, and that's a brother of Jim Shannon, and it was with Dennis that this book was to be written. But sadly, he died in 2021, and for the year or two before that, he wasn't able to contribute very much. In the top right is Michael Lynch, and Michael Lynch started his career in Dublin County Council Parks at 1971, and there were just 3,000 acres. And by 2008, which you can add up is what, 40 something years, 30, let me do the adds, 29 and 8, 30 something years. He left County Dublin with over 7 or maybe 8,000 acres of parks, which was a huge amount to have done in what we'd call a generation. So the book has a good bit of the history of how this came about. But looking at land, one of the oldest parks or green spaces that we had in Ireland was in Dublin was the Huggan Green, which is now College Green and part of Dame Street. There's nothing there recognizable from what it was. It did serve as a Viking burial ground, though, at one time. And we now look at the benefits of parks. That's the second chapter. And this little diagram in the middle outlines the various benefits that I have estimated, and have shown some examples of them there. We always think of the visual reason why these parks are there. They're great. They break the landscape that breaks up the buildings. But that's the environment. They're improving the environment. That's becoming more important now. The bottom left picture is in Herbert Park during the COVID pandemic, and you could hardly get a place to sit down on. I won't go through all those benefits, but the first chapter we're dealing with parks is the Phoenix Park, and it has to have a chapter on its own because it's there since 1662. Well, it was declared a royal park in 1662. I know that you have heard from John, and his second book is on the way, Dr. John McCullen, in the next few months, and he talked about this last year. But I'd like you to look at the bottom picture, which shows you Dublin as it's grown over the years. The red area, the very black area in the middle is 1200 to 1610. That was the size of Dublin at the time. And then when it went up to the 1800, you can see that the Phoenix Park was a very, very significant piece of ground within the city. And now the city's grown all around it. So it's still a very significant piece of ground. It's 4 times the size of Monaco, and it's twice the size of the Central Park. So this is the Phoenix Column, which was once in the middle and is now back in the middle of Chesterfield Avenue. And you can see Chesterfield Avenue with its 3 lines of trees. It's a wonderful, it could be said to be the longest avenue in Ireland, and maybe not even in the maybe even in the UK. But I've seen different comments about places that are supposed to be the longest in the UK, and they're not as long as the Chesterfield Avenue. Of course, the Ars Nuptron is the residence of the president, and you can see there a view of the northern facade, which is the one people see from the main avenue, but it's not the side facing the sun. Sorry, it's the side facing the sun. The northern side is on the other side, which is the entrance to it. That is wrong there. Anyway, it's an 18th century building bought for Vice Regal Lodge, and the portico was added in 1816, designed by Francis Johnson. And of course, it's a place where it's been very often it's been used for ceremonial tree planting. And if you get a chance to visit the grounds of the Ars, you'll find that there are loads of plaques at the various trees when these ceremonial trees were planted. So these two pictures you have, one was by Queen Elizabeth on her first visit to Ireland, and where she planted a tree on the 17th of May 2011. And then one by Barack Obama just about a week later. And of course, as you may remember, he had to depart very fast because the weather broke. But those trees are in a pride of place, upright oak trees. The American ambassador's residence is in the Phoenix Park, and it's private grounds, of course. And you can see the view from the outside. It's a great view of the building from where the deer roam. So it's a wonderful park to have in Dublin. Some of the monuments there, the testimonial to the Duke of Wellington, 62 meters tall, the largest in Europe, erected in 1861, the second largest in the world, to the Washington Memorial. And then the statue of Lord Field Marshal Hugh Gough by John Henry Foley. I don't remember that, but that's a postcard picture which shows that it was a beautiful monument. The interesting thing about the Undersecretary's Lodge, which this was, it subsequently became the home of the Papal Nuncio after 1922. And they discovered they were going to make it into a Taoiseach's residence, but when they went to do some investigation, they discovered it had dry rot, and therefore they had to take it down. And then they discovered it had this castle, Ashtown Castle, which dated from the 17th century. You can see the boxwood that's around it. So many people do not realize that that's the floor plan of the building that was there before. Phoenix Park, a 1.25 million came in the 29th of September 1979 to see the Pope's visit to Ireland. That was a great occasion, and you can see the Pope's cross was left there afterwards. There's an interesting story about how that happened. It didn't have planning permission initially, but it was subsequently allowed to stay there. Now we move on, and we're looking at 19th century parks. Now, the thing about this is many of the parks would fit into the 19th century, but they're in other chapters because they relate more to those chapters. So the four chosen for this are Harold's Cross Park and Palmerston Park, which were designed by William Shepherd and his son, William Shepherd Jr. And Harold's Cross Park was 1894 when it was officially opened, and they had the centenary for it with the Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1994. And Palmerston Park was wonderful. It was a park before 1894, but it became a public park at that stage. And you can see the wonderful trees that's there. Another park that is sometimes overlooked is Mountjoy Square, in the sense that it's not as well known, but this was a park from 1801 to 1938. It was privately owned, and 1938 was taken over by Dublin Corporation at the time. And they used half of it for putting in tennis courts and community facilities. It was designed by John Sutherland, who was a well-known designer. You can see his life years, 1745 to 1826. But Dublin City Council are anxious now that this would be restored, that the other half would be done to complete the original layout, much of which you see in one half of it. And of course, Mountjoy Square itself, somebody told me that Dublin City Council could have bought all those buildings around at one time and had their offices there instead of building what is Wood Quay. Then we jump out to the People's Park in Dunleary, and this was designed by John Loftus Robinson, chairman of town commissioners, who opened the park on the 29th of September 1890. He was an architect, and he also designed St. Michael's Hospital, Kingstown Post Office and Town Hall, and the spire of St. Michael's Church. So this was a very talented man. So he built a Victorian-style park. And you know, when you're in it, you don't realize that it's a little lopsided, but it's lopsided because the railway line was built to take granite down from the Dalkey quarries for Dunleary Harbour, for building Dunleary Harbour. But it's a lovely park, and Dunleary Ratdown take good care of it now. These are some views. The bandstand is a nice feature, and this little house that you see, if you stand inside, you find the floors are slanted because it sinks down a little bit all the time. So we move on now to Dublin squares. Dublin squares, we have some lovely squares, and you can see them there with arrows, white arrows. The best known is probably St. Stephen's Green. Then you have Merrion Square. Rutland Square, which we'll talk about in a little while, and Mountjoy Square, which we've already mentioned. Fitzwilliam Square is on the bottom, and it's the only one that's still private. The others were private at one stage. And this is an area view, and you can see the Phoenix Park is in the distance. St. Stephen's Green, around 20 acres, and depends on where you measure it. You can measure it out to the footpath edge because that's still all OPW property. And if you measure it from the railing, it's of course smaller. See the Fitzwilliam Square on the left, it's a small one. Merrion Square was interesting how it was built. It was built over a period of time, but it only became a public park in the 1970s. Trinity College, I include here as one of Dublin squares, and Ivy Gardens over on the left-hand side. We'll be talking about that in a little while later. So looking at St. Stephen's Green, you can see Sir Arthur, the statue of Sir Arthur Edward Guinness, Lord Ardilaun. St. Stephen's Green existed as a city space from 1630. So it can be regarded as the oldest urban square we have in Ireland, you might say. And it went through different phases of being owned by the residents that lived around it, and then there were commissioners. And Lord Ardilaun was raised in a house facing onto the Stephen's Green, and when he walked there, they had a key to go in and play, and he felt that it should be open to the public. So he thought about acquiring it from the people who owned it, and he got an act of Parliament through, and he spent his own money getting it redeveloped. But when it was redeveloped, this was before it redeveloped, you can see there used to be a statue of King George in the middle of it. And it was there from 17, I'm trying to read the years because the thing is hiding it, but up to 1937. It was well over a century there, and it dominated the green. So it was a lovely, square. And of course, Margaret Gormley, who's in charge of the OPW properties, which are parks, lives in that house, and it's a nice little house. And the house had a bit of a history during the Easter Rising when they were bringing people there who were injured and treating them. The Fusiliers Arch is on the top of the facing Grafton Street, dedicated to members of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers who died in the Second Boer War. You can appreciate that we could do the whole presentation on one of these parks, but we don't have time to do that. So we're just giving you a flavor of these. These are some pictures from the center of Stephen's Green, and the pond, of course, with the pavilion. The lake and the pavilion are very attractive features. Now, a park that some of you may not be so familiar with is the Rotunda, where the Rotunda Hospital is. Sorry, look at the bottom and you see where Rotunda Hospital is. So this, behind it was Rotunda Gardens, which in this picture is called New Gardens, the time this map was done. Bartholomew Moss, Dr. Bartholomew Moss, you see him at the top. His life years were 1712 to 1757, and he raised money to build a hospital. He had £500 put down as a deposit for that whole site from Cavendish Row, Cavendish Street across. He had the whole area, and his idea was to build a garden, to charge a price into it for people and use that money to try and to build the hospital. And he succeeded. Unfortunately, he died in 1759. He didn't get very long to see how well it worked. It was designed by Robert Stevenson and opened in 1749. And there's a picture of it around 1900 to 1910. And you can see part of the garden was still there, but it was subsequently removed as the need for new buildings emerged. And there was £4,000 raised from running the gardens for 8 years, 1749, 1757. I think this is a fabulous part of our history. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore. But you can see what happened here. You see, after the Easter Rising in 1916, when the volunteers all surrendered, they were taken to what was the gardens in the last picture and left there overnight before they were shipped out. And this area has a significance in other ways because before the Rising, they used to have their meetings around here. So to commemorate the Rising, there was a Garden of Remembrance built, and a piece of the gardens were taken back, and you can see it in the picture there, the Garden of Remembrance. So it's a nice thing to have as a memory. It's a wonderful story. Marion Square Park we're going to jump to now, and it was built from 1750 to 1833. But it stayed as that type of park where people could just have a key to go in, do gravel paths and so on. And then it was originally, it's a rectangle about 1,150 feet in length and 650 feet in width. But the original intention was to have it as long as it's maybe goes longer than that, 1,150, to go a couple of thousand feet. But speculators, I suppose, builders, decided no, they wouldn't do that. Another place to look at in that picture is Leinster Lawn, because that was the site of exhibitions back in the 19th century. Very popular in the park is the statue of Oscar Wilde, who's buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, where he died in 1900. And of course, the whole story about Oscar Wilde, and indeed about his father, makes very interesting reading about court cases and so on back in the 19th century. In 1762, this was a private park for the residents. It was bought by the Dublin Diocese for a cathedral, because, as you probably know, there is no Catholic cathedral in Dublin from the Reformation period. But in 1974, the Archbishop of Dublin was under pressure to provide churches and schools and the outskirts of the city as the population was building up. And therefore he leased it to Dublin Corporation for a public park. This is Archbishop Dermot Ryan for 127 years. And it was a controversial park as it was developed, because some people felt that it should have kept its original character, but it wasn't. The pathways were tarmac because it was suitable for wheelchairs, which were now accessible, and for people with prams. There's a great collection, a great array of trees in there. We're now going to jump to the heritage parks and gardens, and you can see the list there: Albert College Park, Blessington Street, Basin, Broadstone Park, Herbert Park, Ivy Gardens. And I won't read any more of them because that's the list. But the one in the picture is St. Patrick's Park, and that's another one of those parks. You see the Guinness family, Sir Edward Cecil Guinness and Lord Argyll and some other supporters bought the land from the cathedral as far up as Christchurch Cathedral, and they set about building housing for the poor of Dublin. But they wanted the area in front of the cathedral to be a park. So this was St. Patrick's Park. And it required an act which was passed by the Westminster Parliament, by the way, because our government was over there at the time. And it became law on 6th of June, 1897, and it was developed in 1901. But Sir Edward Guinness decided he would maintain it for a few years because he didn't trust that the corporation would maintain it properly. But after a few years, he found he'd like to hand it over because it's beginning to cost him some money. It's a nice park today, and it was refurbished in 1988 for the Dublin's Millennium celebrations. And this area on the bottom picture is known as the Literary Parade. It was actually places, bomb shelters to get in out of a bomb, if there was a bomb around, a bomb warning and so on. And the top of it is a lovely garden, which is redeveloped. But those areas were closed off, and in each one of those, there's 12 of them, there's a plaque to one of Dublin's artists, mostly writers like Oscar Wilde, and they're all along there, and you can get all the details if you go along and look through the railings. So it's a nice feature. And then there's bits of art such as the Liberty Bell by Vivian Roche. Now, I'm wondering, and I can't get into asking you, but we'll see how many know this place, because I find most people don't know about this place. This is a public park known as Blessington Street Basin. It was originally a water reservoir for the city of Dublin. Being on a hill, it was able to flow down by gravity. And if you look to the right, you see the long line, Broadstone Park to Royal Canal Bank. Well, that all was a canal in the past, and it came in from a spur from the Royal Canal. In fact, it was the original Royal Canal, and then they put, instead it became a kind of a spur as they directed it to Liffey in later years. And it's a linear park, and it's a very popular little place. So this water was used then for the Irish distillers for a while. But the water for the basin comes from O'Reilly's Bridge, which is over beyond Cabra, and it comes under the ground all the way through Cabra and Phibsborough to the area where you see the valves marked. And there's a gate lodge you see pictured in the moment. So this was originally constructed as the Royal George Reservoir in 1810, fed by the Royal Canal, which brought water from Lough Owel near Mullingar, and it continued to supply water to the north side of the city until 1885. This is the little lodge, which was built in 1801, and it's now going to be used as, it was used for offices, but I believe the plans are to make a little coffee shop with outdoor facilities. But the pond itself, or the basin itself, is a lovely joy. It's so often filled with visitors. People come in all the way from around the place, from three sides you can come in here. So it's very popular. Now we jump across to Herbert Park. These are all in the Heritage chapter on Heritage. And it's not widely known, I suppose, to people who visit Herbert Park, that it was the site of the Irish International Exhibition in 1907. And the only piece that's left from the original exhibition is the pond that you can see there in the upper part of the picture. It's one of those parks that is so successful that it draws its main population from about 3/4 of a mile, whereas most will be from about half a mile. Most parks will get their visitors from there. But it's a lovely park. It's highly regarded, and I'm sure many of you know it well. But this is a picture of the exhibition. Imagine they built those buildings as temporary buildings, and they only were allowed to stay up for 6 months. It was named Herbert Park after the Right Honourable Sidney Herbert, Lord Herbert of Lea, a former owner of the Fitzwilliam estate and father of the Earl of Pembroke. The Fitzwilliams were big landlords, and they owned from the city centre out to Kilmacud. So that's why there's another story there about how they became the biggest part of Dublin to be building. We're going to jump back now, or still on to the Ivy Gardens. It's another place that's a little bit hidden, but thanks to the OPW's activities program, it's quite well known. But this was built for an exhibition as well. And the exhibition is underneath us here, which is now the exhibition hall, which is now the concert hall, was overlooking the site. And Ninian Niven, whom you see here on the right-hand side, was the designer. And it was 1865 that this exhibition was held. So I'm sure you know it well. It's a lovely place to go in and see. And the main feature there is the cascade. And to give you an idea of its scale, look at the size of the people over in the distance. Now, I know they're a little farther away, they're not beside the cascade, but it's nevertheless, it's a lovely big cascade. And the water used to be drawn from the Grand Canal at Poolbeg, but those pipes are all disconnected. It's got a little reservoir at the top and it's recycled water. And if you go there, when you see it going like that, it means there's a pump operating it. But it's a lovely feature. And of course, look at the width of the pathway in there. You don't usually see pathways that wide in city parks. It was designed on a different scale. Killiney Hill and Dalkey Hill is that lovely big area that it has a lovely command over the bay. And it was opened as a public park on the 30th of June, 1887 by His Royal Highness Prince Albert Victor of Wales and dedicated for the 50th anniversary of Queen Victoria. Now, if you read about that, you see that there was quite a lot written about how they went about this. They went out in a carriage from the city centre out to do the official opening, and it's all written up. And you can see on the gates. And by the way, the obelisk that you see on the right-hand side predates all of that. It's a much older one. And we're moving on now to the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham. And I'm sure you know that area, and the Gardener's Lodge at the bottom picture is interesting. But the original layout changed over time. And when this layout was devised, it was decided to include elements of the previous layouts. It doesn't mean this is what it was like years ago. It's restored to something that is indicative of some elements of the previous layout. It's a lovely place to look at. It's a formal garden and very nice views into it, and nice views. The view in the top is of the Royal Hospital from the Gardener's Lodge. And just in case you don't know, I'm sure you do, that the hospital was built in 1684 as a retirement home for British soldiers, and it lasted up until the 1900s. Now we're on to the 20th century parks. Now, this is the period when there was a huge growth in area of parks around Dublin. So the list of the parks are there. Now, that doesn't mean that's only the list, but I had to cut short which places I'd put in. So this obviously this book doesn't include everything, but includes 150 parks. Most of those are well known. These are some elements of what appeared in the 20th century. You have Farmley, and you have Bushy Park down there, which was opened in 1960, and it was a private estate. And the people who owned it were related to George Bernard Shaw. In fact, his mother lived there for a while in the house. And in Skerries, we have a different type of park. We've restoration of old windmills. And one of the parks from the 20th century is Timon Park. This is a regional park. The other regional parks, which I'll be talking about in a while, are former domains, and that's a separate chapter itself. But this was not a former domain. This was land that was acquired by CPO, by Dublin County Council, to build the M50. You see the M50 going through the middle? But they bought out 18 landowners, 18 landowners' farms, put the road through, and Timon Park is built on both sides of the road with 2 pedestrian bridges crossing over from one side to the other. You see all the football pitches. It's got a lot of lakes there. Those lakes are attenuation lakes for the Poddle River, which flows through it. And there's still more attenuation going to happen. The reason the lakes are done is to stop flooding from happening further down the line of the Poddle. Another example is St. Anne's Park in Raheny. But this is former domains we're in now. And it's written on the top, but unfortunately, I can't see it because you have the banner from telling us it's recorded. Anyway, this is the list of former domains, and this would, each of these would be 250, maybe 350 acres of parks, and I'm sure they're better known by most people. I've included St. Anne's here because it was a former domain, and after the Phoenix Park, it was the largest park to be provided in Dublin City. And it was 500 acres originally, and some of the land was used for building the houses there on the right of the picture, All Saints Road, and for building James Larkin Road through and going on to Holt. It has a wonderful avenue of oak trees, Austrian pines, and Pinus nigra, and it also has lime trees. So this is a wonderful avenue, a great place to walk along, and it's a mile long. You can see it there. It's running along there. It looks the bit that's near the house was not planted because that was area was kept open. There was a house there. It says former mansion site, and I don't know if you can see my little arrow floating around or not, but it's there on the left of the top picture. It's gone, of course, and there's a lot of detail about that if you go out and visit the place. It had the only part of buildings that remain are the nursery, where there's some buildings, as well as the stable yard complex. Oh, you can see this is a better picture of the avenue, of course, and you can see where the house was. James Franklin Fuller was the architect. He did a lot of work for the Guinness family. Sir Arthur Edward Guinness was also known as Arderlawn, and he married this lady, Olive White, who is one of the people living in Bantry, and she was Lady Arderlawn, and he died, they had no children, so she lived on for another 10 years, and she died. It went to a nephew called Bishop Plunkett. And after he had a family, he raised a family, but he also had other places. So he sold it then to Dublin City Council. These are the Red Stables, which were designed by George Coppinger Ashland. They're a beautiful complex of buildings. The glasshouse in the top was not part of the original. It was built as a little cafe for people visiting the area, but the cafe is now moved downstairs to where the coach sheds were. And what's happened in St. Anne's in the last number of years is the farmers market has really taken off every Saturday. You can see the bottom picture shows the number of units that come there. It's a wonderful facility. But what's very famous about the park is St. Anne's Rose Garden, which comprises 10 acres. And St. Anne's used to have a partnership with Sir Thomas and Lady Dixon Rose Garden in Belfast. We used to go up and down every year, do rose judging, and we have all sorts of links together. It's a very successful little garden. Jim Shannon designed it, and he wanted to make sure that it wasn't seen from outside. So you can see the main avenue is on the top, but all these trees were planted around it. He wanted you to find it when you went in there, and he succeeded in that. Now, I lived in St. Anne's Park for 2 years, and I had my office in St. Anne's Park for 15 years. So I have a great link with the park. And when I was president of the Tree Council of Ireland, we came up with the idea of the Millennium Arboretum, which was for 1988. So we came up with 1,000 different trees, but we wanted 3 of each of them. We didn't succeed in all cases. And that's the map of the Arboretum. You can see the Asian section in the top and the Irish section in the bottom, European, North American, so on. And they were all labeled and pathways put in, but it needs a lot of maintenance because it requires a lot of maintenance. But you can see on the left side, the picture of it from the All Saints Road. So the trees have matured very well. 1988 until now, so you're looking at heading for 30 years. Now, the regional parks is the other great success story of the Dublin parks. And I've shown you where the councils are, and you can see the major ones that were in the different counties. Now, this is the work of Michael Lynch. His first one was Marley Park in Rathfarnham. in 1971 when he joined Dublin County Council. And I'll be talking about that in a minute. But he said about acquiring these lands that where there was no housing, and to get them as regional parks before the housing would get there. And in some cases, such as Ardgillan, the houses haven't gotten near it yet, and Newgrange and Newbridge as well. So this is a wonderful success story. And they were bought by the council. There weren't developers weren't involved. And the idea was that they would provide greater range of facilities for the community, and they've succeeded in doing that very well. This was the first of them. It was Marley Park, and it was opened on the 29th of June, 1975. But you see on the bottom of it is the M50. Now, the original line of the M50 was to go right through the middle of Marley Park. And Michael Lynch campaigned within the council to get that changed. Now, that helped the golf course that you see on the left-hand side, because it didn't break up the golf course. So that was a great success, and he was very pleased with that, and it gave him the incentive to go and make this happen for other places. These are more pictures. The house which you see in the bottom was the property of David Latouche, who was a Huguenot who came from France, and he was the first governor of the Bank of Ireland. But he acquired the property in 1764. So it was a Georgian house built in 1794 and restored in the late 20th century by Dublin County Council initially, and then it was taken over by Dunleary after 1994. The picture above shows the low stable yard, and you can see the lovely climbing plants providing terrific autumn colour. And then the wall garden is called the Regency Garden, and it was redeveloped in the time of Dennis Shannon, and it has got this building called the Orangery, and the orangeries were so called because they used to put the oranges in pots and put them in the wintertime. Malahide is the next one, and Malahide followed pretty quickly in the 70s. You probably know, I have some pictures on there, you know the castle goes back to the 12th century, but Fingal is looking after it now since 1994. You can see the building in the middle, the dining room, in the top right, a dining room from where the family that lived there, or the family ate on the day of the Battle of the Boyne. 14 of them did not return. This is Lord Milo Talbot, I should say, who was the last owner of the estate, and he had no children. He died suddenly in 1973. And I understood there were discussions taking place about acquiring it anyway, but it became part of his debt duties, and it was sold by his sister. And Dublin County Council bought it, and they have redeveloped the gardens and maintained them. And you see in the bottom right, he was a keen plant collector, and these are some of the slides he took. He was able to travel the world and had such status that he didn't have any problems declaring material. He was a diplomat. The glass house in the top left is not originally from the gardens, but it's a very nice glass house and restored. These are some pictures, aerial pictures of the gardens. As you can see, they're very attractive. This is the place where the collection of plants from the Southern Hemisphere, one of the best collections of plants from the Southern Hemisphere in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's a heritage garden. The next park we're going to look at is Corca Park. And Corca Park is also a former domain. And you can see where the Naas Road is, was all alongside there. And it was bought, originally the land was bought by a guy called Sir John Galvin, and Dublin County Council bought the land from him. They had many ambitions with it, but the park was one of them. And again, this was before there were many houses around it. So the first use of the parks was to grow corn. I went there in 1994, and I had the ambition to build a tourist caravan park, which I achieved within a year or two, and you can see it in the bottom. And this takes in 40,000 tourists per year. from 20 different countries. A lot from Northern Ireland, I might say, during July. And many Northern Ireland people are great customers there. It's Camet Valley Tourist Caravan and Camping Park. This is a view of the park. Birch trees and ash trees form the main planting. And then there's a little garden built on what was the front lawn. And you can see some of the trees around here were brought back from the New World, let's say, during the 19th century. It was owned by the Finlay family from 1716, purchased by Sir John Galvin, in 1983 purchased by Dublin County Council, and since 1994 it's managed by South Dublin County Council. Another project with which I got involved was the Famine Commemorative Arboretum, and this was 1995. I was less ambitious here because we were only commemorating 150 years since the famine. So we only went for 150 different trees. And they've established very well. That's a recent picture. So it's a nice place. There is no signs on them because signs in the public park are difficult, but there's a plan there and all the information is available. There's attenuation lakes in Cocker Park, which is serving a great purpose in preventing flooding for the adjacent housing. Now we're going to jump to Ardgillan, which is out in Skerries, and this was owned by the Taylor family, 1737. They're related to the Headfords, the Headford family in Headford in Kells. And in 1962, it was sold to Heinrich Pott of Bergkirchen, Germany, and in 1982 acquired by Dublin County Council. Again, this was Michael Lynch's work. He worked with the people and helped to persuade them to sell to the council. Of course, then it went into the realm of valuers and solicitors and so on. It's managed today by Fingal County Council, and it's got a heritage garden. It's interesting, as you come down the park, it doesn't look like a castle. You have to go around to the other side of the facade, and you can see in the bottom picture, it looks like a castle. It's a house built to look like a castle, what's called a castle. Some pictures from the grounds. The yew walk is fantastic. It was planted in 1800, and then there's herbaceous borders there as well, which are looking well. They also have a collection of 207 different types of potentillas. And Kevin, you see in the middle of the picture here, I think Kevin's online, was responsible for getting this restored Victorian conservatory redone. And it was put there and opened in May 2022 when this picture was taken. Now we're looking at commemorative parks. You have to consider that many parks serve a purpose other than recreation, and we have quite a number of those. Glasnevin Cemetery is included here, as is the Grange Gorman Military Cemetery, the Huguenot Cemetery in Merrion Row, and of course the Irish National War Memorial Gardens. There's also a little garden in North Strand, which there was 25 people killed when a bomb landed there during the war. And Stardust Memorial Park, which is very much in the news because of the inquest, which is coming to an end on the Stardust disaster, which happened on the 14th of Valentine's Day, 14th of February, 1981. Now, the picture at the bottom is the Croppies Acre Memorial Park, which on the right-hand side, you see also Croppies Memorial Park. That was a project with which I was involved. It used to be known as the Crimean War Trophy Plot. There were cannon there for years. And when they were building that bridge in front of it, the Frank Sherwin Bridge, it became called to replace King's Bridge, which is on the right. This was used for the builders as a compound. And when it was finished, we built a little park there. Then the other one is where there's supposed to be the Croppies from 1798 period buried, and that's what the stone slabs symbolize the graves. Nice little, it's now all managed by Dublin City Council. Jump over then to the Irish National War Memorial Gardens at Island Bridge, and this is a lovely illustration done by Paul Francis. I just really love this. It gives you it all, and it gives a whole sense of its importance. And this was done to commemorate the 49,400, and there's different numbers given, people, Irish people who died in the First World War, out of the 200,000 people who served. It was meant to be opened in 1939, but that was postponed because of the war, and then other things happened. In 1984, then John McCullen went to the Phoenix Park, and one of his first projects was the restoration of this park with an architect, and they both did a great job. And it was officially opened then in 2006 on the 90th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. If any of you haven't been there, it's well worthwhile having a look. It was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, who made a few visits to the place. And he designed war memorial gardens around the world. The one I know best is the one in Arras in France. And it looks very like the same architectural features that are in this garden. Of course, we now go to plant collections. And this is the Botanic Gardens, which you all know well. I don't need to say much about it. But also here is Ardgillan Castle and Gardens, because it's got a heritage garden. Beach Park, Shackleton's Garden in Clonsilla, the Famine Commemorative Arboretum, and in Cork Park, the Arboretum as well. You've seen some of that. Fernhill Gardens in Stepaside, which is in more recent years acquired by Dunleary Rathdown. The Millennium Arboretum in St. Anne's, already mentioned, and St. Anne's Rose Garden mentioned, Trinity College and so on. So this is to show another aspect of parks. So the Botanic Gardens, this is the front entrance. The 2 lime trees are very stately there. I used to, when I was a gardener, I used to look after that front section. The Turner glass houses on the bottom picture, conservatories, I should say. The National Botanic, the herbaceous border, which is a wonderful facility. It was great as a student. I was there for a few years, and it was great to go and learn the plants as they were coming in flower. The rockery, looking its best with the trees, with the maples, and particularly the Japanese maples. Now, the garden at Clonsilla, the Shackleton Garden, is only 1.5 acres, and Kevin was very much involved in this, in getting it restored. It was the David Shackleton's garden. He died in 1988, and his son Jonathan took charge of it. But the aim was to assemble the most complete collection of hardy perennials and alpine plants. And after death, Jonathan managed it until 1995, and then Seamus O'Brien managed it for 3 years, and then new owners took it over. But unfortunately, it became overgrown, and Fingal County Council took it on a license agreement, maybe after 10 years. And with a guy called John Harrington and others that went through it, almost like an archaeologist in finding the plants and letting them get ahead. So restoration continues. The glasshouse was opened in 17 September 2021, and volunteers play an important role in the management of this little garden. These are some more pictures of it. It's well known, its reputation is for the snowdrops. There's a little bunch of them there. And you can see a new glasshouse there as well. This is near the entrance. The pathways were redone. And although this is free to enter any day of the week for those of you near it. Now, rivers and canals is another chapter, and you can see we have a great heritage there too. We have the Dodder River, we have the Tolka River, we have the Liffey River, we have the Grafine, and there's parks all along those rivers, which is wonderful. The bottom picture is the Furhouse Weir on the River Dodder, and that was built in 1244. Imagine, 1244, the purpose of which was to direct water across to the Poddle and bring it into Dublin city. It did so for 500 years. In 1777, it no longer was used because they got other sources. But this is a wonderful piece of heritage. And then this is to show you that the River Liffey rises in the Dublin Mountains, very close to where the River Dodder rises. You can see that almost meet the little streams. And the Dodder is only 12 miles long. The Liffey takes a little longer route, and it goes down through Kildare and comes in. But the Dodder is now, there's a greenway running through it, and there's a wonderful big bridge built over the Dodder out in this area at Old Bourne. Another weir on the river Liffey at Lucan is a famous little area, a new promenade built. But the oldest bridge supposed to be in Ireland is St. John's Bridge in Lucan, and there's only a little bit of it left. Anyway, various authors have said it is the oldest bridge. I haven't studied any of the documents other than what have been given on this one. But the canal then is important. You've the Royal Canal and the Grand Canal. And if you walk along the Royal Canal, you'll find there's a plaque here at Broombridge telling you about Sir William Rowan Hamilton, who was walking along here on the 16th of October, 1843. And he suddenly got to a rush to the brain about a formula for quaternions. So he wrote them on the wall. So now they have a plaque there and there's more information about it. So that's a bit of history. They've Patrick Kavanagh and Luke Kelly, sculptures done by John Call. They're over on the Grand Canal, and you see it there on the left. The Grand Canal is on the south line here, this big curve. The Royal Canal goes up straight away from the Liffey now, but it wasn't originally that way. Another section then is the coastal parks, and we felt it was a good idea to do this because so many parks were built along the coast. The one here that you see is the North Bull Island, which was an accident because it was when the North Bull Wall was built in 1821 that this island developed. But others were built, such as Irishtown Nature Park, which I'll show you in a moment, Sandymount Promenade. They were built along the edge of the urban area. So you can see Dunleary Harbour, then you have the People's Park, which I mentioned earlier. So there's the list of the parks which are in the coastal area chapter. And here you have North Bull Island, which is down at the bottom, and Irishtown Park, which was the first nature park to be built in Dublin. It has, you see it on beside the two towers. And I remember being asked to do a design for it, but football pitches were out of the question. So we built a nature park. It's very, very popular. That's my last slide, and thank you for your attention.
Well done, Christy. I think, is there anyone that has any questions?
Will I stop sharing for the
Chat.
moment, and you can get back to see is there any chats? No.
No chat as yet.
Everybody's happy, obviously.
Unmuted myself here. It's Jackie Hart.
Hello, Jack.
Hello. And that was a fantastic, just a staggering variety of parks, which I hadn't realized at all there. I was wondering about the maintenance. How many staff? Where do they get trained? I mean, there must take millions of, well, not millions, but a huge staff to keep those all in order.
Well, I don't remember. I can't say I have figures on the staff, but I can tell you, I showed you a slide of Barney O'Reilly and others, and I was number 5 into that network as a professional park superintendent at the time. Today, there are 70 parks and landscape officers in the 4 councils and in the OPW, and they're directing teams of people. There would be some work done by contract, but when I worked in Dublin Corporation, we had 470 staff. And when there was a government incentive for people to retire early during an economic recession, 100 of those left. So I think it's down below 300 in the city at the moment. When I was in South Dublin, we had 150 staff and there's 4,500 acres. I don't know the staff numbers for the other places, but I'm sure it could be 1,000 staff altogether. When you add
certainly, in Northern Ireland, we were very disappointed that there was a lot of diminution of the upkeep in some of the parks during COVID. And I was wondering if you had the same problem in Dublin as well, that, you know, it's taking quite a lot for some of the parks to get back on their feet in some ways.
The biggest problem that I'm aware of was the amount of litter